Hello, everybody. My name is Suneal Bedi. I'm an assistant professor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. And this work is in connection with Professor David Reibstein at the Wharton School of Business. And what we're looking at is what we want to term national self-enhancement bias. And the idea is to look at nation brands, the brands of nations, and see how individuals rate their own nation versus how the rest of the world rates that similar nation. So just give you a background on what self-enhancement bias is. Essentially is the phenomenon that individuals view themselves more highly than they view others on various dimensions. I view myself as more ethical than I view others. I view myself as more athletic than I maybe view others. And this phenomenon exists with respect to extended selves as well. So people view their own friends, families, and social groups more positively. I think my relationship is better than other people's relationships. So what we kind of predict is because national identity is also a part of the extended self, it stands to argue that individuals will view their own countries more positively than they view others, right? So that the self-enhancement bias would extend to my citizenship. And so a logical corollary of this, which is our first hypothesis, is that ratings of a nation, right, basically the brand of a nation, measured by its own citizens will be higher than the ratings or the brand of that nation measured by non-citizens. And we term this national self-enhancement bias. So the idea again is that citizens of a nation will view that nation much better than non-citizens of a nation view that non-citizens of that nation view that same nation. Okay, but we also know there's heterogeneity in self-enhancement bias. So many studies have shown cultural differences. Japanese and other East Asian individuals have been shown to experience little to no self-enhancement bias in comparison to their Western counterparts. Now, there's a lot of reasons why. I think a lot of these studies go into communal versus individualistic cultures. We are less concerned about the mechanism, although it's super interesting to think about, simply more concerned or more interested in the fact that this phenomenon has been shown to exist. And so, given that, we would predict that East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, will likely show less or no national self-enhancement bias in comparison to their Western counterparts. Okay, so what did we do to actually try to measure this and to try to tease this out? Well, this was a study that was done in partnership with the US News Country Rankings and BAV Consulting. So what US News and BAV Consulting and Wharton as well do is they go out and they collect a lot of data and rank countries on various metrics. And I'll show you all those metrics that they rank countries on. To do this, they simply ask people, right? Does a country have this specific characteristic or not? And you'll see what these characteristics are. Is that country a leader? Is that country corrupt? Is that country fun? Does that country embody gender equality? And the idea is that respondents rate this 1 or 0. 1, they have that, and 0, they don't. Then what they do is, US News, together with Professor Reibstein and myself, will, come up with a score and then rank countries, on an overall score, but we'll also rank countries on, subgroups. So we'll rank countries on, how economically productive the company is. And so, or the economically productive the nation is. And so, perceptions of like economically influential, economically stable, entrepreneurial, favorable tax environment, all of those may come together to form some, economic subcategory. And with that, we rank countries. So we have all this data and we said, listen, we have all this data. Let's see if we can look at national self-enhancement bias with respect to this data. So there's 80 countries in the big set. In the big set of what US News looks at, there's 80 countries. Now, each individual only rates 30 countries and only rates it on 30 characteristics. Remember, I showed you over 60. It only rates it on 30 characteristics. So it's manageable for the respondent. And they're randomly assigned these 30 countries. So it's possible that they get their own country. It's also possible that they don't get their own country in those 30s, the country that they're from. So here are the countries, the general 80 countries that we look at. And again, each individual just gets a sub 30 of these countries to rate. Okay, so responsibility rate of 30. So generally the big sample is that, if we look at the total sample, is 20,000 individuals from 36 different countries around the world. Now, what we're concerned about though, is the ratings of countries by people who live in those countries. So if we just look at, remember it's randomly assigned, if we just look at those people who rated their own country, our sample is about 7,500 people. So 7,500 people rated their own country, including other countries. And that's a sample we're going to look at for national self-enhancement bias. This is the demographics of that sample. Okay, so what did we do? How did we kind of do this? Well, as I said, every individual rates a country 1 or a 0, right? They give the country a 1 or a 0 for a given characteristic. So, we are in, or this conference is in Korea, right? So South Korea, I might get South Korea, and on South Korea, I get 30 different attributes. I get, it is unique, it is economically stable, it is technologically advanced, whatever. And I put 1 if I believe it is, and 0 if it's not. I then go to a different country. Maybe I get the United States. I'm presenting this from, Indiana in the United States. So I may say, well, the United States, are they politically stable? 1 or 0? Are they, do they have favorable environmental policies? 1 or 0. So then what we would do is, or at least what I did is, I took every characteristic, right? So all these 60 characteristics, right, that I had data on, and I averaged the ratings of that characteristic, the 1s and 0s, for people that were from that country and people that were not from that country. I then took the difference. So if you think about it, if the average of a 1 characteristic is 1, that means that everybody believes that that country has that characteristic, right? If it's 0, it means everybody doesn't have that, or it means that everyone thinks that that country doesn't have that characteristic. So everything is in between 1 and 0. What I then do is I take the difference. I take the difference of the average for those that have rated each characteristic based upon being citizens of that country, and then the average of that characteristic for those that rated that country for not being citizens. So a positive difference would mean that citizens of the country rate themselves, right, more highly on that characteristic, and a negative would be the opposite, right? So positive would be how high the positive indication would be, that citizens of a country rate it better on that characteristic than non-citizens of that country. I then took the percentage of positive differences, right? So the higher the percentage, right, the more overconfidence, the more characteristics the citizens of that country are overconfident about. I also took the net differences from the average ratings across each country to get a net score, which indicates the magnitude of the national self-enhancement bias. So the percentage indicates how much self-enhancement happens, on how many of the characteristics is there a self-enhancement bias. And the net score represents to what degree is the magnitude of that self-enhancement. So what you see is something pretty interesting, right? You see most countries in 90% plus overconfidence measure. That means that on every characteristic, or at least on 90% of the characteristics, citizens of those countries rated themselves more highly than non-citizens. And if you look at the lower, so that in some ways tells us that hypothesis 1 is true. There is a sense of national self-enhancement bias. Well, but if you look at some of these countries, South Korea, Italy, Brazil, Japan, these have quite low overconfidence measures, which would tell us that the self-enhancement bias is much lower here, which in some ways is, again, consistent with the cultural differences with respect to self-enhancement bias. I've broken it down a little bit further here. This is just Japan. So in red, you see the Japanese ratings of Japanese individuals of Japan. And in blue, you see the rest of the world, how the rest of the world views Japan. And so what you see is that the Japanese view themselves as not that different, not that distinctive, not that entrepreneurial, not that individualistic, not innovative, not unique, while the rest of the world does view themselves, does view Japan as having those qualities. So internally, the Japanese citizens don't view themselves as positively, or don't view their country as positively, the brand of the country as positively as the rest of the world does. And so we think this is important. It's important because first of all, we've always thought about external brand perceptions, right? The perception that others have of us, of our country. They drive foreign direct investment, tourism, students. But internal nation brand perceptions are also important and often go unnoticed. So much like employees, citizens are national brand ambassadors. And so it's important for countries to manage internal nation brands as well as external brands. And when there's this difference here, when there is a lack of self-enhancement bias, it could be problematic. It could be problematic for countries because their citizens are not promoting the country enough, just as employees wouldn't be promoting the brand. So we think this raises really interesting issues around nation brands, around how we brand, and we would love to hear your thoughts, questions about this project and what this project is accomplishing. Thank you so much.